This is the fifth already in this series of 7 webinars exploring the relationship between museums and the Sustainable Development Goals and how they can be mutually supportive agendas and opportunities. So we'll cover 2 topics today about sustainable tourism and research for the SDGs. And so these are two separate topics that I covered in this guide that I wrote in 2019, which I wrote to help museums and their partners to get started with sustainable development and to understand the Sustainable Development Goals. And just as a kind of recap, the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed by the world's governments, all of them, in 2015. Based on a big stakeholder exercise consultation that lasted about 3 years before that. There are 17 goals and 169 targets, which is, let's face it, quite complicated. So I put together this scheme of 7 activities that museums all more or less do, or they can do. And I think of these as kind of a bit like channels on the television. These are channels or opportunities that museums can use to support the SDGs. So if we think just very briefly, well, when we're talking about tourism and tourists, just for some kind of common understanding that tourism is just a subset of travel and tourists are a subset of travelers. People travel for many, many different reasons. There may be domestic, inbound or outbound travelers. And quite often a visitor is classified as a tourist if their trip includes an overnight stay. Or they might be called a day tripper or a same-day visitor if it takes 1 day. These are just very flexible definitions. But there's a World Tourism Organization is one of the UN-affiliated agencies, and it has an excellent code of ethics from 1999, and it talks about some of the benefits that tourism can bring. And so I don't have time to talk about all of these, but I'll just introduce some of them and just to talk about how they relate to the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. So the first one, that tourism contributes to mutual understanding and respect between people and societies. And this links very well with 3 SDGs in particular around reducing inequalities. Inequalities means within and between countries. Sustainable cities and communities are about places that are good and safe and good places to live and that thrive over time. And around peace, justice and strong institutions is basically about a peaceful and tolerant society. The second principle is around tourism as a vehicle for individual and collective fulfillment. So this links very well with goal 3, which is about health and well-being, linking to quality of life. Quality education, where we learn about different cultures and different places and one another. And again, goals 10 and 11, which I mentioned on the previous slide. And this idea of tourism as a factor for sustainable development. And as we've spoken about in previous webinars, sustainability is this point in the future when considerations of people and the planet and prosperity are in balance with one another. And so our idea here of tourism as a factor for sustainable development is talking about how tourism can help bring these 3 things more into balance. It has to be said it can put them out of balance, as we'll explore, but this is saying that tourism can help to create this better world that we really strive for and we really need. And that can support different goals around conserving biodiversity, life on land, providing jobs and opportunities for craftspeople and particular skills, goal 8, and again, goals 10 and 11. And tourism as a user of the cultural heritage of mankind or humankind and a contributor to its enhancement. So if we can think about heritage, particularly from the 1980s onwards, there developed a kind of heritage, almost like, well, you would call it a heritage industry, which has particular challenges associated with it when we think of something as an industry, because heritage, whatever we pass from one generation to another, is a right. We all have a right to access and to contribute to our own heritage and to understand the heritage of others. And so this is talking about how tourism can really help to both preserve heritage and also to help enhance it. And that links particularly with Goal 11, which has a particular target within it. 11.4 is around to strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard cultural and natural heritage. And the two goals that I've put here are the two that are most closely linked with conserving nature and biodiversity. And lastly, I think this is the last of these points I'll take from the Code of Ethics. It's saying that tourism can be a beneficial activity for both host countries and communities. And that's a very important thing to consider in tourism, that it's a relationship between people and places. And so, although I've just picked out some of the goals there is a really useful short publication from the World Tourism Organization, which talks about how tourism is related to all 17 of the goals. And as we've seen in previous webinars, the goals are a connected kind of network. They're not a series of boxes. And so just as we can contribute positively to each of them, we also often have negative impacts, and sustainable development is about enhancing our positive impacts at the same time as reducing our negative impacts. So this is a really good publication. I really recommend this. And there are two in particular, these are two SDG targets that are very closely linked to tourism. Recalling that there are 17 goals, which are, kind of big chunky areas of activity. And within them, there are 169 targets, which are the much more operational and much more practical element of the whole agenda. And so the main one to consider really is target 8.9, which exists within the goal, which is around economy and jobs. And it says target 8.9 is by 2030 to devise and implement policies to promote sustainable tourism that creates jobs and promotes local culture and products. There is another target, which is in goal 12, is for responsible production and consumption, which is develop and implement tools to monitor sustainable development impacts for sustainable tourism that again creates these jobs. So what that's saying there is that that's a kind of acknowledgement that tourism also has negative impacts. So we need to look at how we can monitor how we can break this kind of link between tourism as a form of consumption and the benefits that it brings. And that's how can we bring tourism more into the circular or green economy. There is another target which I've not listed here, which is around bringing tourism benefits to small island states, which are particularly dependent on tourism, but we'll talk about that later. So as I mentioned, we have to remember there are problems associated with tourism. It can create tension. So when local communities are outpriced by gentrification, is where, for argument's sake, a new museum or a new attraction develops, that increases house prices around it, and then the local communities can't afford to live there. We find that more in big cities or very particularly where cities or sites enter onto become very major tourist destinations. It has to be said, we also find that happens not just in relation to built heritage, but in relation to very beautiful and nice natural places where local communities may not be able to afford to live there. We also find problems when tourists, particularly when they come in large numbers, put a lot of pressure on local services. so that local communities are a bit kind of left out. They might not be able to, just to take an example, they might not be able to get on the train because the train is full of tourists. Or the roads may be very congested, and so local communities can't go about their daily lives or their daily work. There can be environmental problems with litter, increased waste, increased use of water, management of sewage, and particularly the large carbon footprint of travel, particularly air travel, which we'll talk about shortly. And there can be another problem, a great risk really, which is when an organisation, if we take a museum, comes to be really reliant on financial income from outside the region. It increases risk because it means that you're dependent. You're not a kind of master of your own destiny. You're dependent on other people's choices. That increases a thing called volatility. You know, it's just a high risk. And it also depends on what else is happening elsewhere. So for argument's sake, you may have a lot of tourists come from one particular place. If an airline was to open a new cheap air route to somewhere else, tourists may go there instead. And then your income stream has disappeared. So sustainable tourism, but a lot of people prefer to call it responsible tourism because sustainability is ultimately about responsibility. So let's call it responsible tourism. It's about making better places for people to live in and better places for people to visit. So that again talks about this relationship between, you know, where people have come from and where people go to, and how they interact with other peoples and the local community and the heritage there. So responsible tourism requires that operators, hoteliers, governments, local people and tourists take responsibility to take action to make tourism more sustainable. And of course, in that list there, I would include museums and other cultural institutions. And there was this comes from a thing called the Cape Town Declaration from 2002, which is a really excellent short overview of some of the principles of sustainable and responsible tourism. And so these are some of the main elements of the Cape Town Declaration. That responsible tourism, because that's what I prefer to call it, is about minimizing negative impacts. It's about generating greater economic benefits for local people, and it enhances the well-being of host communities where people go to. Responsible tourism involves people in making decisions. It makes positive contributions to the conservation of natural and cultural heritage, for instance, by bringing in some income to help maintain them. It provides more enjoyable experiences for tourists through more meaningful connections with local people and a greater understanding of local cultural, social and environmental issues. It provides access for physically disabled, sorry, I must have the word people off the end there. So it's mindful of minorities and ensuring that they're not left behind from tourism. And it's culturally sensitive, and it engenders respect between tourists and hosts, and it builds local pride and confidence. So we can see across here what I talk about, these three main elements of sustainability, about people, planet and prosperity, but also the other two elements that were introduced in the SDGs around the importance of peace and the importance of partnerships between different sectors, different people from different areas, people as visitors, as consumers, and people as hosts. But we have this growing problem of what's called over-tourism, which has been defined as the impact of tourism on a destination that excessively influences the perceived quality of life of citizens or their quality of visitor experience. So that is the opposite of sustainability. Sustainability is the ability to continue to exist, to develop in positive ways. So sustainability, often people think, is about trying to keep something the same, which is not really true. It's about trying to ensure that it's getting better. It's not enough just to do no harm or to minimize negative impacts. We have to be trying to make a positive contribution to all of these three things: people, planet, and prosperity. And so there are a number of drivers of over-tourism. And mass media, and so we can take some particular examples. And so I'm from Scotland, and Scotland's a very beautiful place, and lots of films have been filmed there. And when a place becomes very associated with a, you know, like a blockbuster film, let's take an example: Harry Potter films. Lots of Harry Potter locations were in Scotland. They become a kind of magnet for tourists, and that can create problems. So one of the things to say there is just about how heritage sites kind of have to enter into agreements with filmmakers and so on, with a lot of careful consideration, because it may have unanticipated effects. We see the same in Dubrovnik, which was used to film part of the Game of Thrones series. So it has a huge number of tourists who are followers of that series. Drivers of over-tourism, the second I have here, is around higher income and borrowing in some countries. So a growing middle class in some countries, which have more disposable income, and so they wish to travel. They have the financial means to do it. Incredibly cheap air travel, which is due to a low taxation of aeroplane fuel. If it was taxed in a different way, flights just would not be so cheap. For many coastal places, there's an increasing number of cruise ships, especially very large cruise ships, and they can create this problem when a large number of people, 4,000 or 5,000 people, come to a small place, and they all appear at once. They use the local services all at once, so local people may not be able to access them. Social media, so both in terms of it's quite easy, it's much easier to get to access information than it used to be, particularly for cheap deals for holidays, but also an increased desire for people to have images of themselves in locations, images to post on social media profiles. And lastly, and also linked to social media really, is the phenomenon of Airbnb, where again you can end up with properties get bought up in tourist destinations, and then local people can't find somewhere to live because they've been kind of bought out as Airbnb places. But I mentioned that the link between tourism and environmental damage can be huge. So tourism amounts to roughly 8% of greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change, which is an absolutely huge amount. And tourists are responsible for between 30 and 80% of the national emissions of some island economies. And that's extremely problematic. And we also find that the numbers of tourists are increasing exponentially. So we still, it's rather surprising to me, to be honest, that we still see that the majority of tourists are still tourists visiting Europe, although it is just in physical terms a much smaller area than many of the other regions there. So we see that the number, so two things to point out here. The number of tourists is going up exponentially, but the proportion who visit Europe is possibly going down a bit. And you have an increasing proportion visiting Asia and the Pacific. If we look at the emissions per person from international aviation, so these are the emissions in relation to people in terms of the country they come from. And we can see Latvia there, fairly consistent with much of the rest of mainland Europe. We can see some small hotspots which have the darker red colour. But we see that the countries of the global south, unsurprisingly, make a smaller contribution to these emissions than the global north. If we look at where people are going to, then this again points out this that most visitors are visiting Europe. And again, you can see there that it's just highlighting that although Europe is a relatively small area in comparison with the other regions, it's a big magnet for tourists. And these are just some resources linked to responsible tourism. The one I would say, the point I would just to draw attention to with the first one, which comes from UNESCO relating to the World Heritage Scheme, it talks about sustainable tourism, but it talks about development in the sense of economic and social development, and doesn't really cover environmental impacts. And so these are just some examples. So one of the classic places that suffers from over-tourism is Venice. And you see here these huge cruise liner with lots of people on it. And we see this, this again as a classic as the Louvre, the Mona Lisa, where I think it's fair to say there are as many people looking at their phones as there are looking at the painting. And it's a kind of mass consumption. So now I'm going to talk and just some nice examples here. This is a place called Lusnava Manor in Latvia, which is a great example of responsible tourism. So it developed from a series of underused buildings. It's 25 kilometers to the nearest town. It's in a rural area in the eastern part of Latvia. And so people were consulted, local communities were consulted in how should the manor be developed? You know, how should the facilities be developed as a cultural centre to make use of these disused buildings. And so here we have a good example of a disused sauna, which looks fairly in a fairly poor state, and was converted into a guest house. Which gives the building a future, which I think it's fair to say it didn't have before. Another example here is of a converted woodshed into a cultural centre where people can explore and take part in cultural events. Looks really, really nice. Lusnava Manor, it provides opportunities for local craftspeople to make and sell products, and the examples I've got here are sustainably themed products. And these are some examples where people come together to plant trees and to look after the natural environment. And so I kind of draw attention to this because it's about the interaction between those two aspects of people and environmental sustainability is really good. And here's a nice example of something called the Nature Concert Hall, which is a Latvian kind of initiative where scientists collaborate with musicians and artists to raise awareness of a particular species or group of animals. In this case, it was on bats, because Lusnava Manor is an important place where bats live, and so they have these nature concert hall events have been shown to raise awareness of how people understand bats. They do workshops with researchers and conservationists, and that'll relate to the next topic I'm talking about as well. And then we have an example here called Musa, social art projects where people can take part in decorating these artworks. So it's about providing opportunities for people to come together, to have creative experiences and contribute to the cultural life of the community, which is a human right. And so it's a really great example where we see all of these things about how the manor has been developed to implement policies that promote sustainable tourism, creates jobs, promotes local culture and products, but does many more things as well. You know, it brings together all of these three aspects about people, planet, and prosperity. It helps to create a peaceful society by people coming together and by working in partnership. That's the only way that these things can be achieved. And so I'm just going to talk quite quickly now about research and the Sustainable Development Goals as a completely separate topic, but in the same way that we might think of education or culture as just crucial for achieving all of the SDGs, the same applies with research. So although we can find it in particular places, it is really also important in covering the whole agenda. And so these are just some of the targets that I've picked out that are related to research. I don't propose to go through them all, but just to highlight that research is linked to sustainable agriculture, public health, which of course we see is, you know, in these COVID times is a hugely important topic. Goal 9 is around industry and innovation, which is where research often is thought to sit. And I'll just draw attention to this target 9.1 about developing sustainable, resilient and inclusive infrastructures, because collections, you know, research collections are an infrastructure. They're part of the basis from which research can happen. Research is really crucial to strengthening our ability to face climate change, the dark green targets at the bottom left, reducing ocean acidification, promoting sustainable fishing, and also really importantly about how we collaborate across sectors and across countries, and particularly with the global south, to share knowledge and capacity and information so that everyone can make use of scientific collections and research. And so just to say, museums are also centres for three particular forms of research, collections-based research, because we have collections, taxonomy, the description and naming of species and working out what lives where, and heritage science, which helps us both preserve heritage, but also to make sustainable and responsible use of it. And really, to support research, resources need to be four things. They need to be available. They need to exist in the first place, but they need to be in a good condition. They need to be well cared for by conservators and curators. There's no point having collections if they're not accessible, both physically, but also discoverable, so that people can find them, rather than having to go to each museum's website, how the information can be aggregated, can be shared, can be grouped. Resources need to be appropriate, they need to be relevant to particular fields of study, but also they need to be developed effectively over time so that collections don't get left behind. And this is particularly important in the context of a changing world. So I'll give you a short example, is based on a project I did a couple of years ago, looking at the relationship between museum collections and biodiversity conservation. And so we know that nature is in decline worldwide because of these 5 main reasons: land use, overexploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. We know that the declines are accelerating, and we know that goals for conserving and sustainably using nature are not working. But we also know that nature can be conserved, but it will take massive change, transformative change. And this comes from an assessment that was done in 2019. And so I took something called the 100 questions. It was a group of questions that were put together by a consultation exercise of researchers, global researchers, to say, if these 100 questions could be answered, what are the top 100 questions that would help conserve biodiversity? And so I run a project with some funding from the British Ecological Society, and it's published in this guide, which you can see the link to there. And what I did was I asked researchers and biodiversity conservationists on the one hand, which of these 100 questions do you think museums could contribute to? and I asked the same thing to people who worked in museums and looked at if there was a sharing of perception. And so I asked nearly 500 experts, researchers, conservation managers from 84 countries, and they told me that a third of the biggest questions, so over 30 of these questions could be answered, at least in part, by museum collections. That's a really massively important result, saying that, of the 100 biggest challenges, if we could answer these questions, those would make the biggest difference for conserving biodiversity. And so we now know that a third of those can be helped along by museum collections. But what's needed to help support research to conserve biodiversity using collections? So as I mentioned before, we need these things called aggregated online catalogues where lots of museums and other kinds of information source put their data on what objects and specimens they have into this thing called, particularly one called GBIF. And that's to say that it's really important that collections have basic documentation, which is, I'm not sure how it is in Latvia, but certainly in the UK is not a very easy thing to fund. We just need very basic information on what these things are, what they are, what species they are, where they came from, what date, so that people can discover these collections. We need complete online catalogues of particular collections. Collections need to be well curated and accessible, and they need to be developed over time. And we need specialist staff who are able to answer inquiries from researchers and others to help people to make use of the collections. And so I've got a really nice example here from the Latvian National Museum of Natural History in Riga. And so they had an exhibition, and it's kind of brings together research and conservation of biodiversity and public engagement, because what I'm trying to get towards over time with these webinars is to say that these things are very interlinked. That these 7 activities that I mentioned in the guide, they're not like 7 boxes. They overlap with one another, and that's fantastic. And so the project had a travelling exhibition as well. There were training events for teachers from specialists at the museum. It makes use of museum research collections, and it's linked to museum-based research. And so this relates to a whole range of SDG targets. Around target 4.4 is about empowering teachers and others to have the better knowledge to understand topics. Target 4.7 is around understanding education for sustainable development, so that people have the information to live in harmony with nature. Target 11.4 helps to protect the world's cultural and natural heritage, because as I mentioned, invasive species are one of the 5 main threats to biodiversity. Promoting lifestyles in harmony with nature, and lastly, preventing invasive and alien species from spreading around. But I thought I would just conclude with an example of an exhibition I saw, but this was in Washington, DC last year, just at the very start of the COVID crisis. So the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, National Museum of Natural History, had an exhibition on, by coincidence, that was about pandemics and from diseases that originate from animals, what we call zoonotic diseases. And so at the time when they were showing this exhibition, they also used it as a source of information on public health. So it would talk about how many people had been affected by COVID, and we can see at that point it was really, really early days. It talks about what you should know. And it also talks about how collections can contribute to understanding pandemics and managing them in the first place. And so there's a great quote here that we can work backwards if we need to find the animal reservoirs for viruses that we don't even realize are there yet. So because collections are, there's a nice line that says that collections are 4-dimensional. They have the 4th dimension of time. that we can go back and study collections and answer questions about, ask questions of them that people had no idea about at the time when those collections were formed. That's why it's really important to maintain collections that cover long periods of time and continue to be developed. And there's a very famous photograph here of someone called Roxy Laybourne, who was the bird curator at the Smithsonian bird collection. You can see she's surrounded by all these drawers of birds from the research collection. And so we have an example here from tracking disease vectors. So this is from a collection of mosquitoes at the Smithsonian's Walter Reed Mosquito Unit. It's got over 1.5 million specimens of mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are one of the main vectors, what pass agents of disease from between different animals to humans, and are hugely important, because with climate change, malaria carrying mosquitoes are spreading much more widely, and not just malaria, but other diseases as well. An example, just to link back to the bats that I spoke about from the Nature Concert Hall, that these are bats that have been collected to study diseases from them. And bats carry many diseases, but they are not affected by them. So many coronaviruses originate in bats. They have these coronaviruses. It's not their fault. They don't do the bats any harm. The problem comes when people interfere with the bats, either by killing them to eat them, or by bringing them together, to eat them, and then having them in close proximity, close to other species. That's how diseases are encouraged to spread from one species to another, is extremely problematic. And lastly, just to say, like museum collections and exhibitions, we can use them to convey research results. So we know that we cause epidemics, but we know that we can also stop them. So this is about applying research and helping people to make use of it, and ultimately looking for how people in nature can live together in harmony. And that's the end of my talk. So I thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you.